Following the revolutions of 1848, the Austrian Empire emerged battered but intact, with Franz Joseph I assuming full control. The revolts in Vienna, Budapest, Milan, and Prague had been violently suppressed, and the neo-absolutist system that followed was a reactionary backlash against the revolutionary upheaval. The empire remained centrally governed by the crown, with local nationalisms repressed. However, this was a temporary duct tape solution that did not address any of the real underlying issues. Despite neo-absolutism, serfdom remained abolished, and the nobility had lost much of their traditional power. Austria's economy was in shambles from years of war and revolution, and the government's refusal to adopt constitutionalism left many dissatisfied. The situation worsened when Austria alienated its former allies in the Crimean War. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, having aided Austria in suppressing the Hungarian Revolution in 1849, expected support from Ferdinand, but Austria remained neutral and instead occupied Wallachia and Moldavia themselves, hoping to expand Austria's influence in the Balkans. This betrayal made Austria diplomatically isolated. Russia now saw it as an enemy, and Britain and France were forced to sanction Austria for the exact same reason they were at war with Russia. In 1859, Austria suffered a humiliating defeat against France and the Kingdom of Sardinia, eventually losing Lombardy. This military failure, coupled with economic struggles, forced Franz Joseph to reconsider his rigid absolutist rule. By 1860, Ferdinand tried implementing measures to ease the pressure by granting autonomy to regional nobility, but this satisfied nobody. Hungarians wanted full independence, while Austrian liberals viewed the reforms as insufficient. A year later, he replaced this measure by establishing an imperial council, or Reichsrat, made up of top nobility from across the empire. But Hungary largely rejected participation as it refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of Austrian control. Issues in the Imperial Council quickly arose, as questions of finance were intertwined with questions of governance. The Hungarians on the council eventually leveraged their position to reinstate the Diet in Hungary. This was coupled with the restoration of parliament in Austria as well. Hungarian was restored as the official language in Hungary, and the traditional organs of the Hungarian state made a return, such as the Curia. An obvious divide emerged between the two halves of the empire by this point. Split by the Leitha River, two distinct halves were known as Cisleithania, or Austria, and Transleithania, or Hungary. However, many in the public regarded these measures as too little too late. Many notable Hungarians refused to take part in the new arrangement and criticized the handful of elites in the Imperial Council as traitors. Even in Austria, young liberals saw the new parliament as a powerless appeasement measure, with the real power still held by the crown. As the 1860s progressed, national tensions deepened. The Austrian parliament was rigged against the Slavs, with Czechs, Poles, and Croats underrepresented due to deliberate gerrymandering, and thus they became increasingly disillusioned. In Hungary, nationalist resistance was more active. Hungarian students protested, and symbols of the 1848 revolution became rallying points. In 1860, the Austrian military fired on a Hungarian demonstration, killing a student. His funeral turned into a political event, worsening anti-Habsburg sentiment. The 100th birthday of Ferenc Kazinczy, the prominent Hungarian nobleman who we discussed extensively in episode 1 of this series, similarly became a public opportunity to decry the much-hated Habsburgs. A new fashion trend even emerged in Hungary, which saw people dressing in traditional Hungarian attire as a symbol of resistance. The death of Széchenyi, as discussed in episode 2, similarly pushed tensions to the breaking point. Passive resistance became the norm in Hungary, mainly observed through active tax evasion. The Hungarians remembered that they had willingly joined the Habsburg Empire in 1723, through an agreement that recognized their autonomy and right to self-rule. However, they grew increasingly frustrated with being treated as just another province of Austria. Francis had done nothing to address the grievances that had originally led to the Hungarian discontent, so it was no surprise when these tensions resurfaced. Like the Poles and Czechs, the Hungarians refused to send representatives to the parliament in Vienna. When the parliament convened in 1861, 140 of its 343 members were absent. Francis attempted to dissolve the Hungarian Diet, but by then, the political awakening in Hungary was unstoppable. Hungarian radicals sought support from the French, hoping to acquire arms and provoke a war between the Italian states and Austria. However, the Hungarians soon found unexpected allies among Austria's liberal factions. Many Austrian liberals grew concerned about the rising influence of Slavic populations, which they believed was inevitable. They feared that as the electorate expanded, Slavs would eventually overpower the German population. To prevent this, they saw compromise with the Hungarians as the only solution. Thus, out of this common fear of Slavs, cooperation between Hungarian elites and Austrian liberals emerged. Their alliance was built on a shared opposition to growing Slavic influence, forming the foundation of the eventual Austro-Hungarian Compromise. Amidst this unrest, Austria was decisively defeated in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, forcing it to abandon its ambitions in Germany. Bismarck's Prussia had emerged as the dominant power, and Austria was expelled from the German Confederation. With Austria's prestige shattered and its military weakened, Franz Joseph had no choice but to turn to the Hungarians to preserve his empire. Franz Joseph reached out to the Hungarian statesman Ferenc Deák to begin negotiations. Ferenc Deák came from old nobility in Hungary. His moniker in Hungary is the wise man of the nation, or a hazabölcse. He was the most distinguished statesman of Hungarian politics after 1848. He was a member of parliament during 1848 and briefly served in the first Free Hungarian government as the justice minister. However, he would resign before the revolution ended, sparing him from retribution after the Hungarian freedom flag was put down. He is famous for bridging the divide in Hungarian politics, bringing together all ends of the Hungarian political world to the negotiating table. The second key figure in Hungarian politics during this era was Gyula Andrássy, who aided Deák in negotiations with the crown. Andrássy's strong anti-Slavic stance played a crucial role in persuading Francis to accept a compromise. Andrássy, as a former field commander in 1848, had fled to France after Hungary's defeat. In his absence, the Habsburgs symbolically hanged his effigy during the Arad executions, earning him the French nickname Le Beau Pendu, the beautiful hanged one. Returning to Hungary in 1858 under amnesty, Andrássy quickly aligned with Deák. While Deák united the Hungarian political forces at home, Andrássy's rhetoric, rooted in anti-Slavic sentiment, helped convince Francis to agree to the compromise. He reportedly told Vienna, quote, "You take care of your Slavs and we will take care of ours," end quote. Franz Joseph's wife, Queen Elizabeth of Bavaria, more commonly known as Sisi, played a crucial role in the Hungarian cause. Favoring Hungary, she was tutored by a Hungarian noble who instilled in her a deep appreciation for the Hungarian history. She learned the language, earning widespread admiration. Working with Andrássy and Deák, she subtly influenced Francis Joseph towards a compromise, even supposedly using sex as a tool to advance the cause. She would have a portrait of Deák hanging above her bed for the rest of her life, sparking rumor and controversy in the imperial court. Deák's negotiations ultimately culminated in the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, or Ausgleich, of 1867, creating the dual monarchy. Austria and Hungary became two separate states under Franz Joseph, who ruled as Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. They shared only three ministries: foreign affairs, war, and finance, while everything else was governed separately. The compromise was driven by mutual self-interest rather than unity. The Austrians feared growing Slavic influence, recognizing that without Hungarian support, they would soon be outnumbered. Hungarian elites, meanwhile, sought to maintain their dominance over Slovaks, Romanians, and Croats, rejecting Slavic federalist demands. The Slavic population were completely excluded from decision-making, despite making up a significant part of the empire. In 1866, a Slavic Congress in Vienna attempted to coordinate demands for federalism, but internal divisions doomed the effort. Czechs, Poles, South Slavs, and Slovaks all pursued different policies, allowing Austria and Hungary to divide and suppress them effectively. After the compromise, Hungary embarked on an aggressive policy of Magyarization, suppressing the Slovaks, Romanian, Ruthenian, and Serbs within its borders. Only the Croats retained some autonomy, but even they faced cultural repression. In Austria, some concessions were made to the minorities, but German maintained political dominance, and the Slavs remained disenfranchised. For example, minorities were allowed schooling their own language in Austria in certain areas. This, however, was very little in the way of a thank you for saving the Habsburgs during the 1848 revolution. The Habsburg Empire was now no more. Instead, a delicate German-Hungarian hegemony was imposed upon the whole empire. A hegemony which was delicate precisely because nothing was done to solve the underlying issues of a multi-ethnic state. Historian John Connelly writes, quote, "Yet, if Austria-Hungary was no empire, it was propelled by imperialist energies, based in the joint desires of German and Magyar elites to subjugate Slavs and convert them into higher culture. The combination of condescension and fear led the monarchy forward and also downward." End quote. One minority that thrived under Hungary's new arrangement was the Jewish community. Many Jews embraced the Hungarian identity and actively promoted it, becoming key agents of Magyarization. Jewish teachers, journalists, and artisans spread Hungarian culture and language into Slovak and Romanian areas. They also entered the landowning elite and faced little prejudice from Hungary's upper classes, creating a unique synergy, one paralleled only in Poland. This relationship would later give Hungary a distinct position in the 1930s and World War II, as anti-Jewish sentiment was less prevalent among its elites, but that's a topic for another day. On the 1000th anniversary of Hungary's settlement of the Pannonian Basin in 1896, Budapest underwent a dramatic transformation. A grand new parliament building rose along the Danube, Buda Castle was reshaped, and Fisherman's Bastion was added, landmarks that now define the city's skyline. If you visited Budapest, you've likely seen them and visited them. These projects were intended as both as a celebration of Hungarian nationhood and a symbol of its progress. By the 1890s, Hungary's liberal elite had grown increasingly conservative and resistant to reform. The countryside remained stagnant, trapped in a neo-feudal system that stifled industrialization and progress. The urban centers flourished under dualism, but the countryside was left behind. By 1914, Hungary had barely modernized. Rural peasants remained illiterate and disconnected from growing cities, while the lower classes watched Jews rise in social status, but found themselves unable to advance. This frustration would fuel the ideological radicalism that emerged in the early 20th century. Austria-Hungary, the non-empire entity fueled by imperial energies, as described by Connelly, pursued imperialist ambitions relentlessly, which ultimately worked against the interests of dualism. Franz Joseph's policy had led to an era of managed decline, of a hybrid system which ultimately would not last. The Slavs repeatedly called for a trialist system, which would include the South Slavs as a third equal partner alongside Austria and Hungary. These demands were outright rejected by the Hungarian elites, who feared losing control. In 1896, Franz Ferdinand, nephew of Francis Joseph, became heir apparent. Recognizing the empire's deep-seated issues, he sympathized with the Slavs and sought to curb Hungarian dominance. He envisioned a centrally controlled federal state, believing that without reform, Slavic discontent would eventually fracture the empire. Ironically, he was assassinated by Slavic nationalists setting off World War I, and ultimately the collapse of Austria-Hungary. Yet, anti-Slavic sentiment persisted right up to the war's outbreak. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza was the lone voice in parliament opposing the war with Serbia, not out of pacifism, but because he feared annexing Serbia would further tip the balance of power towards the Slavs. By then, however, it was too late, and the gears of history were already in motion. Austria-Hungary's existence was predicated on managing internal divisions, yet its leadership consistently prioritized elite dominance over national integration. The dual monarchy was a temporary patch rather than a solution. Hungarians and Austrians used it to suppress their own minorities, while Slavic aspirations were ignored. Ultimately, the contradictions of a multi-ethnic empire, ruled by two privileged elites, could not hold against the rising tide of nationalism. At the outbreak of the Great War, Austria was a corpse barely limping on, held together by bureaucratic inertia. The war merely accelerated its inevitable disintegration, as the empire's many nations saw the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy as their final opportunity for liberation.